Hi everyone. This is our class for the 26th for English 116, where we are continuing to talk about short stories. Last class we had talked a little bit about Rose for Emily, and I wanted to continue with that, as well as introduce Young Goodman Brown and Soldier's Home. And as you know, in terms of uh, A Rose for Emily, we talked a little bit about the Southern Gothic tradition. We talked a little bit about the plot and the mixed chronology. That's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to be able to figure out the ending of the particular piece. And Faulkner did that very deliberately. And talking about Faulkner, he gave an interview. I unfortunately was not able to find the link for free online, but it is included in your textbook. About On a Rose for Emily, and he was asked some questions about the text, including the meaning of the title. And in my opinion, he gave a very unsatisfying answer, that he basically talked about that A Rose for Emily was merely that the poor woman had no life at all, and it was a rose for Emily, and that was that. And I think there's so much more that we could say about the symbolism of a rose, whether we talked about a rose as a flower, something that is delicate and beautiful, but also has thorns that can hurt. And I think that parallels Miss Emily in some respects. Whether or not we wanted to talk about the idea of a rose being something that oftentimes is given at funerals, because of course the story is about death, or oftentimes given as symbols of love. Whether or not we wanted to talk about color imagery associated with the rose. Roses can be many different colors, but usually people think of the red rose. Red comes with all kinds of associations, whether it be blood or passion or danger. All of those seem to work with A Rose for Emily as well. Even if we wanted to think about color imagery in terms of the color rose, there's lots of references to Miss Emily's bedroom at the ending of the story about it being rose, which is sort of in between red and white. And I suppose you could think of red and white as the extremes, such as are talking about black and white as the extremes, and rose being something in the middle. Perhaps you could talk about rose in terms of it being a verb, the past tense of rise, and the sense that in the South, oftentimes individuals would rise when a Southern aristocrat, especially a woman, entered the room. And definitely this story is about the rising, if you will, of the North against the South, if you want to think about it from a symbolic perspective, and about the death of an old Southern aristocracy, which Miss Emily represents. In fact, Faulkner was asked about imagery and asked, could Homer Barron represent the North, and could Miss Emily represent the South? And he said that, well, that's not impossible. It wasn't the intent of the author to say. And he talks about himself in the third person. Well, let's see. Miss Emily should represent the South, and Homer should represent the North. That is just merely writing about people. And then he goes on that it was more of a battle between God and Satan. And I remember being very surprised when I first read that. And so was the interviewer, who asked Faulkner to elaborate a bit on that. Faulkner had talked about Miss Emily knew that you're not supposed to murder people. So it was basically a story of good versus evil. And I'm a bit unsatisfied with Faulkner's answers. I don't know if it's because the interview was given decades after he wrote the story and he doesn't quite remember, whether or not it was because he just didn't want to give away the answers to the reader. He wanted the reader to work for it, whether or not he was just being coy with us, knowing that whatever he said, we would try to dissect it. But it's hard not to think of Homer Barron, the laborer, as representing the new North that's coming and taking over the Old South, as represented by Miss Emily in the Old South. Someone who clings to the old ways, someone who refuses to pay her taxes. She was basically taking advantage of a system that would give her privilege because of status and position that she earned through slavery. And now, of course, slavery has been eliminated. Miss Emily is still desperately clinging to that status and position. Her house is a representation of that. It would have been one of these old Southern plantation houses and very much decorated in the Gothic tradition, but that is falling into disrepair, much like the Old South is falling into disrepair, much like Miss Emily herself is falling into disrepair. Lots of references to Emily living in a dead past. She's writing in calligraphy. She is holding on to her father's corpse for 3 days and is not willing to accept his death. She refuses to pay taxes even though the new politicians in town are demanding her taxes. In fact, she says, well, you should speak to the former politicians. They've been dead for years. And the former politicians just created a story in order to allow Miss Emily to keep her dignity. And the story they created was that Miss Emily's father had owned the town money, so therefore they were going to pay the Grierson family back by eliminating Miss Emily's taxes. But of course, that was just a fiction. It turns out that Emily didn't have money anymore. Again, she wasn't profiting off of the system of slavery. Therefore, she didn't have money to pay for her taxes, but the town didn't want to confront her, illustrating how intimidated they are by her, and also illustrating, I suppose, how they wanted to cling to the idea of what she used to represent. You probably noticed, or I hope you noticed, the we narration in this story. We learn much more about the community than we do about Miss Emily. And the community comes off very negatively. They're very gossipy and self-centered. When they think that Emily is buying arsenic because she might kill herself, instead of trying to intervene, they watch to see what will happen. So obviously, we learn a lot about some of the negatives of the Southern community, especially in the context of the New North as represented by Homer Barron and his sidewalks, which would represent progress, taking over the Old South. And I think that those ways of viewing the story are much more interesting than what William Faulkner himself suggested, but he's the author after all. One of the reasons why I wanted to give you that interview, to illustrate that even if the author doesn't necessarily agree with a particular position, as long as that position is valid and you can support that position, then that's all that really is necessary. So we could support the position of a rose having symbolism. If nothing else, think about how oftentimes roses are kept as mementos, impressed and kept forever. And one might say that Miss Emily does the same with Homer, is that she keeps him forever and dries him out, much like a dried rose. Of course, we aren't given the specific details of what she's doing with Homer. We're just given enough details so that we can piece everything together by the end. That the smell that's coming out of Miss Emily's house is the decaying corpse of the murder victim, which is Homer. But since we're told all of these pieces of information in non-linear fashion, it might be easy for us to miss what would be some obvious clues. And even if we were able to put all the clues together, even though they're given to us in non-chronological order, and determine that, yes, Miss Emily had used that arsenic to basically poison Homer because he refused to commit to her. We're even told that he wasn't he was somebody who liked men, less about his sexual orientation, and I think more about the fact that he wasn't likely to commit to her. After all, he was just visiting in town, would likely leave at that point. But nevertheless, if you miss that first climax that Miss Emily had killed Homer, which is why he disappeared, then perhaps you might be surprised by the second climax. That not only did she keep the body, but she was lying next to it years after the body had decayed, because the evidence is a strand of iron gray hair, and her hair had turned gray long after the disappearance, aka murder, of Homer. So anything that your imagination can conjure up at this point would be much worse than anything that Faulkner could give us. And certainly you can read this story literally, but the whole point of literature is to read it symbolically. And whether we wanted to read the rose as a symbol, or we wanted to read Homer as a symbol, or whether or not we wanted to read Miss Emily herself as a symbol, and there are lots of other ways that this story can be read as well, but I suggest that all of these ways are much more complex than what the author himself has suggested with A Rose for Emily. And again, I don't know if that's because of the length of time that had elapsed between the interview and the piece, or whether the author wanted to not necessarily divulge too much about his story, but just the idea of narration and the we. If Miss Emily had told the story, we would get a very different story. Not necessarily saying that Miss Emily would give us an accurate account, but one of the more interesting things about A Rose for Emily is that we learned so much about the Southern community at this time period, and it doesn't come off as being very positive. Of course, there are problems with this story, the use of the N-word, for instance, and I think it's important to note the time period in which this story took place. It gives us a sense of a historical period. It would be fascinating to learn more about Miss Emily's servant. And he never really has a major role in the piece. In the past, of course, he wouldn't have been a servant. He would have been a slave. But we don't get that perspective, nor do we get Miss Emily's. We get the Southern perspective of a decaying Southern aristocracy illustrated through Emily, who's described as a fallen monument, if you will. And of course, we're told about how the townspeople have observed Miss Emily throughout her lifetime and have used her as fodder for entertainment and gossip. Some might say that this was their social media of the time period. So those are some things that were interesting with A Rose for Emily. And if we were to move on to two other pieces, one entitled Young Goodman Brown and the other entitled one entitled Young Goodman Brown, the other entitled Soldier's Home. We'll do Battle Royal next class. You'll see that both are similar in that, yes, we've got the literal story, but peeling beneath the layers of the literal is the figurative or the symbolic, especially something like Young Goodman Brown. Now, Young Goodman Brown is an older piece. It was written in 1835. It sounds like it was written in the 1800s. So this might be a more challenging piece for you to read because ultimately the language is much more archaic. It's set in New England, our area, specifically Salem, Massachusetts, which comes with a lot of history and folklore associated with the Salem witch trials. And Hawthorne actually had relatives who were involved in the Salem witch trials, and he was quite upset about the persecution, the unjust persecution against individuals who were classified as witches merely because they weren't considered part of the norm of society. And we can see how he references that idea within his short story. In fact, going back to William Faulkner, his background is from the South, and he talked a little bit about, in some interviews, his ancestors owning slaves and profiting off of the system of slavery, and his embarrassment about that. Not to say that all pieces of literature have to be autobiographical investigations, but I think you can see how many times there is a correlation between the author's biography and the piece that they're inspired to write. And I like Young Goodman Brown as an example because it basically gives us a sense of our time, or of our area, in a time period that would have been early New England. If you'll remember that, basically this is the oldest part of the United States. In order to understand Young Goodman Brown, you need to understand a little bit about Puritanism. And you might have heard of the Puritans, and they were a very strict religious group that formed in England, and basically they saw the world in very simplistic terms, black and white, good and evil, and nothing in between. And because they were persecuted for their beliefs, they came to America and settled a New England, hence New England. And the great irony is that in Salem, they actually persecuted individuals who did not fit into their vision of normality. So basically, they did the same thing to others that was done to them, usually women who were viewed as outside of the norm. This piece is an allegory, which means the entire thing is representational, it's figurative. And that, yes, Young Goodman Brown is indeed an individual, but he also is supposed to represent youth, innocence, being naive. Goodman, he is a good man. Goodman was also a title that was used at the time, much like Mr. And brown, not black or white, somewhat in between, or something muddied or dirty. And of course, we are told about the wilderness, which is where Goodman Brown goes into. The wilderness, of course, being a great metaphor for the idea of the journey of life, and that we all have to take at one point or another. And there is lots of associations with brown and dirt and mud, and all of that works so nicely with Goodman, who was a young and innocent man. And basically, he, at sunset, which is the time of descent or darkness, is confronted by his wife, Faith. And that's a literal character, Faith, but she also is representational. She's also symbolic. She represents Goodman's faith in religion and humanity, even in himself. She tries to stop him from going on this wilderness mission, that which is wild and untamed, but he continues to do it. And that shows that on some level he knows that there's something evil or amiss, but he's still nevertheless going to engage in it, which shows the temptation that all of us have at one level or another to engage in the darker sides of the life journey. And he confronts this stranger who may or may not be a devil or a personification of a devil. And that's what we see throughout the entire piece, is that it seems like there's going to lead to some supernatural event with a witch meeting, and that this figure is a supernatural figure that is tempting Goodman. But there's an equal amount of evidence to show that this is also just an ordinary event. And in fact, at the very ending of the story, we're asked point blank, had Goodman Brown fallen asleep and dreamt of a witch meeting? And the answer we're given is, be it so if you may. In other words, if you'd like, fine. It doesn't matter. What matters is not what happened. It's how Goodman changes because of it. And if you'll remember, at the beginning of the semester, we had talked a little bit about the deconstructionists, those individuals who look for deliberate contradiction in works. And young Goodman Brown is a great example of this. Every time there's a piece of evidence to show one interpretation, there's another piece of evidence that negates it. So yes, it could be that this is a supernatural figure. He's carrying a staff that is wriggling, so like a snake. And of course, snakes have lots of imagery, Christian imagery, with evil and with the devil. And then it's immediately undercut where we're told, well, that must have been an ocular deception. And this happens over and over again. And supposedly there was this great fire at this supposed witch meeting, but then Goodman sees there's dew on the trees. So how could there have been fire if there was dew on the trees? And again, the whole point is not whether or not there really was a witch meeting, not whether or not there really was this evil traveler that seems to look like Goodman and Goodman's family, or whether or not this is just a personification of Goodman himself, or a dream, or some sort of subconscious element. What matters is what Goodman learns on this journey, the journey that we all have to take, about the hypocrisy that exists in the world. And while that might seem very obvious to us in 2024, it wouldn't necessarily have been that obvious during the time period of 1835, especially for Puritans, who saw individuals as either being holy and saved or evil and damned, with nothing in between. And notice the symbolism of just the number 3, which is a Christian symbol as well for Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Goodman is a newlywed. He's been married for 3 months. Again, the idea that he's a newlywed is supposed to represent being innocent and naive. And his faith, when she holds him back a while, that's also his religious faith, is holding him back a while. And what Goodman finds out is that everyone seems to be on this journey to this great witch meeting. The church leaders, including Goody Cloyce, who taught him his catechism. This is particularly significant because that would be the equivalent of a Sunday school teacher. Politicians, and again, in our time period, our jaded time period, we say, well, of course, politicians are hypocrites. Professionals, widows, family members, even Goodman himself, because he is on this journey. He's horrified by it all. And in fact, the devil goes through, or this traveler who could be the devil goes through and exposes all of the terrible sins of individuals behind closed doors. How a woman eager for widow's weeds, in other words, she kills her husband so that she can become a widow. Or how fair damsels, basically, blush not, sweet ones, we're told, have bidden me to a funeral for an infant's death. Basically, how young women who portray themselves as virgins are not virginal and have pregnancy outside of marriage, or an unwanted pregnancy, which they abort and then they bury the fetus in the garden, and of course tell no one. Or how the youths have made haste to inherit their father's wealth. And again, the idea of heirs killing their fathers so that they could get the inheritance rather than wait to receive the inheritance, and all of the other sins that could be committed by everyone. At one point, Goodman even sees Faith herself there, which makes him wonder, what sin has she committed? But of course, she also represents his own faith. And the ambiguity, maybe it was a witch meeting, maybe it was a dream, I think works very nicely with the ambiguity of humanity, that most people aren't good or evil, they're combinations of the two. And the lesson to us, of course, is that evil exists everywhere, in religion and humanity, and within Goodman as well. That's the one thing he can't accept, that he himself was part of this journey. And we learn what happens at the end, that he became a darkly meditative, sad, distrustful man. And the lesson to us is not to do what Goodman did, and then he completely lost his faith in humanity, so he dies with no hopeful verse upon his tomb. In other words, that he is going to go to hell because he has lived a life of isolation and he has completely abandoned faith in others. And we shouldn't do the same when we learn about hypocrisy. Not if we learn about hypocrisy, but when we learn about hypocrisy. Because at one point or another, we will have our faith tested in other individuals or even within ourselves. And that's part of the journey of life. And that's the lesson that we're supposed to get in young Goodman Brown. And then if we go forward to one more piece, Soldier's Home. And this one is an easier piece to read, partially because of the time in which it was written, 1925, but also just because of Ernest Hemingway's style, to be very concise and fairly simple, but that doesn't mean it's simplistic. And what we end up with is a very timeless piece. In fact, all of these pieces are timeless in some ways and very contemporary, but Soldier's Home in particular, because it gives us a story, I think, of what we still struggle with as a society on a very visceral level, the idea of war and what happens when veterans return. Keep in mind that in 1925, they didn't have terms such as post-traumatic stress disorder. At the time, it was known as shell shock. The idea of Soldier's Home leads to the question, what is home? Home should be a place where you're understood and loved and accepted unconditionally. That's not what Krebs finds. Notice he's referred to by his last name so often in the story. And Krebs, his surname, is how he would have been referenced in the military. And the military uses surnames in order to remove individuality. Krebs also means cancer in German, and one could say that war itself is like a cancer, and it just sort of eats up the individuals. And even though Krebs has returned from war, that doesn't necessarily mean the war is over for Krebs. We're shown a picture at the very beginning, actually two pictures at the very beginning. One shows Krebs with his fraternity brothers. They're all wearing the same height and style collar. And then the other shows him in his military picture. And we can see how a fraternity is somewhat similar to the military, and that the removal of individuality, everybody is dressed the same. And that could be some foreshadowing for what he experienced or a hint of what he could have experienced in the military, but that picture of him in the military shows the ugly reality where they're too big for their uniforms. Perhaps they've outgrown the idea of the military representing only patriotism, which is the way that service would have been portrayed, especially in 1925, with no question asked of any other possibility. You don't see the Rhine in the picture, so some of the way that military would have been sold, and some might even say propaganda, about the ability to be able to see the world if one goes into the military. But in this particular instance, we see how the Rhine doesn't even show, so he wasn't even able to get a tourist shot. And the girls were not pretty. Again, that would be another way that the military would be sold to soldiers, is that they would be attractive to the opposite sex, the assumption that they would be interested in a heterosexual relationship. And again, that picture completely deflates the conception, or the romanticized conception, of being in the military and serving in the war. And the result is that Krebs has returned in body, but not necessarily in mind. And he questions everything now because of his experiences in the military. And again, this might seem very obvious to us in 2024, though we still struggle with the idea of reintegrating veterans back into society. You can only imagine what it would have been like in the 1920s. We know that Krebs went to a Methodist college, and we know that his mother prays. We don't know if Krebs himself was religious, but we know he had a religious background. And at this point, he can't pray with his mother. One assumes it has something to do with his experiences in the military. The questioning of how can God exist when such horror is evident in the world. We see how fickle and superficial civilians are when Krebs returns, and that Krebs doesn't get a hero's welcome because it's assumed that the hero's greeting is over by this point, as if somehow there is a timetable that is appropriate for a soldier to return, and if a soldier doesn't do that, that somehow negates their service. We see how ultimately Krebs is engaged in isolating activities. He's reading, he's at home eating lunch, he's practicing the clarinet, and he's also playing pool, which works so well from a symbolic perspective. Because in pool, not only is that a game that you can play by yourself, but you aim and shoot in pool, and of course you aim and shoot in the military as well. All is very deliberate. And lots of references to the idea of Krebs trying to avoid consequences, especially relationships, because that comes with risk and vulnerability. And of course, he was vulnerable and had risk in the military, no longer wants to do that. He talks about that he would like a relationship as long as it was a relationship that didn't come with romantic entanglement. This is why he preferred the German and the French girls, because there were language barrier issues. So they really couldn't communicate on the level that he could with an American girl. And one of the reasons why Hemingway is perhaps an easier read is because it's dialogue driven. And I know that much of the dialogue might raise some eyebrows. In particular, Krebs's dialogue with his sister. When his sister asks, "Will you be my beau, my boyfriend?" And he says, "Sure, I'll be your beau." And we're not supposed to read this as an incestual episode. This is more hero worship of a very young sister who really doesn't understand the implications of what she's asking. And of course, he's able to say, "Sure, I can do that," because it doesn't come with any kind of serious or significant romantic entanglement. It wouldn't come with the consequences that Krebs fears so much. Notice that the sister uses a nickname for Krebs, Hare, H-A-R-E, not H-A-I-R. Hare is a large rabbit. And you can think about some of the associations with rabbits, being timid, being fearful, being hunted, living in holes, and how that might apply to a soldier, being fearful, being timid, foxholes, things of that nature. And his mother uses Harold's first name, or Krebs's first name, Harold, which makes sense because she is his mother. And note that while he has multiple conversations with his mother, who's quite concerned about him and the fact that he hasn't reintegrated back into society, and at least in a way that she considers to be normal, he never has a direct conversation with his father, which illustrates the distance that he has with his father. We don't know if that was a distance that existed prior to the war, but it certainly exists now. And of course, the conversations are, when will Krebs settle down? When will he get a job? When will he become a productive member of society? None of these are bad things. The question is, when is he ready, and how can he be ready after what he has experienced? So what we find is that the parents even offer Krebs the car, something that represents independence and freedom, ask any adolescent. And one would think that he would be very interested in the car that he was not able to have prior to the war. But Krebs understands that the cost is too high, that it comes with strings, it comes with expectations, that he's to use the car in order to date, to have a relationship, he's to use the car to get a job, and he's to use a car to be, quote, normal, unquote. And of course, he's not ready for any of these things, so he's certainly not ready for the car. At the ending, we see after Krebs struggles with, all of these expectations that he's unable to fulfill, he decides that he is going to move to Kansas City and he will get a job. And he will see his sister play indoor baseball as she asked him to do. And we can see that ending as both positive and negative. We can see it as positive because now Krebs isn't isolating himself. He's going to go see his sister play baseball. He is going to try to reintegrate back into society and become a productive member of society. And going to Kansas City might be the smartest thing, realizing that he's never going to change his family. Therefore, he has to start anew. But we can also see it as negative, that he's merely appeasing his family and he's not confronting his issues. By going to Kansas City, he's running away rather than facing his family and his problems. And again, he's going to watch indoor baseball mostly to appease his sister, not because this is something that he truly wants to do. And I think that those sorts of endings that have both positive and negative associations with them are much more realistic to what we experience in life itself. That life is complex, and these stories are equally complex. And I like the fact that we don't know what happens to Krebs afterwards. I prefer not to know and to speculate than to have a poorly written sequel about what happens. But think about how all three of these stories lend themselves to interpretation and analysis. And that was really the point that we were trying to get to, I was trying to get to, when we were talking about what is literature, and specifically canon, those works considered by scholars and critics that are worth literary study. And that also applies to film. Not just to short story, or not just to drama, or not just to poetry. So we basically have read 3 short stories at this point. Actually, it would be 4 short stories at this point that I think could be considered to be canon, though of course you could argue the opposite. Certainly there is a subjective nature to canon, but the idea of canon is that it comes with a certain level of quality. And definitely when we read A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman, I think you could see the contrast between the two, that A Secret Sorrow was really predictable and trite, and once you read it once, there probably wasn't any reason to reread it. You wouldn't get any new meaning. Language was not used in any kind of unique or creative ways. Not that that's in any way to disparage romance novels, but something that's written in a genre usually follows certain criteria, and it's usually done primarily for entertainment and profit. Not that there's anything wrong with either one of those. But when we talk about literature, it's probably done for more than just entertainment or profit. It's done to create art. It's done to make some sort of social statement. It uses language in interesting ways. It can be reread or reviewed, and each time you do so, you can find new meaning within the text. So those are some of the things to consider when you're thinking about canon, and also contemporary relevance, and that the canon should be something that is timeless and universal on some levels. And I would argue that all things might be timeless and universal on some levels, because basically stories are about humanity, and humanity is a timeless and universal journey. But some pieces might be more contemporary than others. So that's something else that you can think about in terms of as we're going through these pieces. But I hope, if nothing else, you would see that A Sorrowful Woman, and you would see that A Rose for Emily, and that you would see that Young Goodman Brown, and you would see that Soldier's Home have a level of depth and complexity to them that would allow further interpretation if you so decided to write a paper on them. Much like if you so decided to write a paper on Citizen Kane, it may not necessarily have appeared so on the surface when you were first viewing Citizen Kane, but upon a second viewing, after hearing Roger Ebert's analysis, which just is the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, that you would see that there is a great amount of depth and statement within that piece that deserves further analysis. Not that you have to devote further analysis to it, but obviously when it comes time for you to submit in a paper, you get some choice as to which piece to choose and what to write about. I have suggested paper topics, but you can also create your own as long as you have them approved by me. So where does this leave us? This leaves us with next class talking about Battle Royal, and also talking about popular mechanics, and finally talking about writing the paper. And of course, as you know, we lost a class because of inclement weather, but we are catching up, so I encourage you to keep up with the syllabus, even though I may be a little bit behind. And you'll see that very soon we're going to be transitioning over, and we will be moving to a drama. And this means that we get to talk about what is a drama, how do you read it, how do you watch it, and of course, we are going to read and watch drama. In fact, 3 specific dramas: Oedipus the King, and then A Midsummer Night's Dream, and then finally we'll end with A Raisin in the Sun. And dramas are different than short stories. They're longer, which means we have multiple classes devoted to them because we need to see performance, and we also need to read them. And dramas are meant to be performed, but if they have literary elements associated with them, which these dramas do, you'll want to read them carefully. So watching a performance in no way is a substitute for reading. Both should be done. And I say all of this because soon we're going to transition. So what would be ideal, though I understand the world is not always ideal, what would be ideal is that when we begin talking about our first major drama, that you would have read it in its entirety, even though we've got multiple classes devoted to it. And our first major drama will be Oedipus the King, after we talk a little bit about some of the conventions of drama and how to go about reading drama. Oedipus the King is a very old drama, 430 BC, and it is from Greece, and we are reading a translation. So we are reading it in the English. So that said, it is a question for us as to why we would be devoting so much time to something that is so old and so seemingly far removed from our time period. So we'll talk about the historical importance of Oedipus the King and the thematic importance of Oedipus the King in terms of understanding drama. And what would be ideal is when we're talking about Oedipus the King, you are reading the next drama, which happens to be A Midsummer Night's Dream. And when we spend multiple classes watching and talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare, you are reading the very last drama, and that happens to be A Raisin in the Sun. And then in terms of Raisin in the Sun, when we're talking about it, you are beginning to think about your second paper. But at this point, of course, this is much in the future. We're now in our first section still, which is in the fiction section, which is film and short story. So the idea is that you are beginning to contemplate what you could write your first paper about in the fiction section. And I have the due date for the first paper being approximately the 13th of March, which would be immediately before spring break and halfway through the semester. So it would be a good idea to get your paper in then or earlier, rolling deadlines for my papers. Not that I'm averse to getting a paper after that, but certainly soon you want to be able to have some formal feedback in the class. So we will, in the next couple classes, in addition to continuing to talk about fiction and putting some closure on the fiction section, we will also be talking about writing papers. So this is a time for you to kind of contemplate what you think you might want to pursue with writing a paper. But at this point, we have an attendance question to work with, and this question will be due on Wednesday. And as you know, if you need additional time, just ask me and I can grant you an extension. You're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. That would give you an idea of some of what we would talk about during a class if we were meeting face-to-face. So last class I had asked you to talk about an important quote from A Rose for Emily. This class I'm going to ask you to talk about an important quote from either Young Goodman Brown or Soldier's Home. You get to decide which story, and talk about why you think it's important. And of course, what we will do next class is talk about our next short stories. That happens to be Battle Royal and Popular Mechanics, and I'll have the links for those below. As you know, I'll always provide you with free links if I can find them. And of course, the stories are included in our textbooks as well. And that means when we are done with Popular Mechanics, we are done with our fiction section, which means we can devote more time to thinking about our first paper and also time to transition into our next unit, which happens to be drama. So again, please identify a quote that you think is important from either Young Goodman Brown or Soldier's Home and indicate why you think it's important. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class with fiction. Take care. Bye-bye.